I'm your host, Dan Sutter, with the Johnson Center for Political Economy here at Troy University. This past summer has seen a number of proposals and protests and even strikes in favor of a raise of increase in the minimum wage to perhaps $12 or even $15 an hour. This has been accompanied by strikes recently at McDonald's and other fast food restaurants. Earlier this summer, it was protests at Walmart and other major employers. To discuss this topic of the minimum wage and a related issue of the living wage, I have with us tonight two of our colleagues here at the Johnson Center, Dr. John Dove and Dr. Dan Smith. Gentlemen, so we've had these proposals to substantially raise the minimum wage, and we see here we have a slide from the recent strike against McDonald's, and then also the city of Seattle is one of the cities that has adopted, or at least proposed, a formal ordinance to raise their minimum wage. They already have, I think, one of the highest minimum wages in the country. So if you can, for just a few moments, John, why don't you tell us what we mean by a minimum wage, and then this other idea of a living wage?
Sure. A minimum wage, when we look at it from an economic standpoint, it's simply a legally enforced and legal limit that you can pay employees. So you're not legally entitled to pay employees below that limit, even if employees and employers are voluntarily willing to work at such a wage. Generally above what would normally be the market wage, versus a living wage, which is something that generally we think of as being even more substantial than a minimum wage, so even above what a minimum wage would be, in order to cover living costs and to sort of provide some sort of decent, however we might define that, decent living standard for individuals.
And the living wages can, in some cases, be quite substantial, right? Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. The living wage is required to, if looking at just to take care of yourself or provide for your family and kids, those can drastically rise as well for each adult, and as subsequently as you have more kids or more people, members of the household. So if you try to raise the minimum wage up to living wage, obviously the minimum wage is going to have to go up to meet that.
Right, here we have a slide, courtesy of some folks at MIT, who have estimated throughout the country what a living wage might have to be for different different family circumstances, it suggests. And I think, as I recall, these numbers were calculated if you had one worker who was trying to earn all of the money that would be necessary to support these different types of families. So if you had just one adult, the living wage for Troy was estimated to be, I think, just under $8 an hour. But for a family with an adult with 2 children or 2 adults with 3 children, you can see that the living wage would be up over $20 an hour. So if anything, that seems to be even in excess of some of the proposals to raise the minimum wage have been calling for. So then what are some of the costs then of a minimum wage? And why do economists, many economists, think it's a bad idea? So John, I guess we can start with you.
Sure. Anytime that you see something like a minimum wage, again, it's always some sort of price, in this instance, price for labor, that would be above what the market going rate would be. So anytime economics would suggest, anytime that you see something like that, you can expect that as a result of this higher price, the demand for labor, the demand by employers, will actually decrease relative to what it otherwise could be. And also the supply of labor, the number of employees available or potential employees available, will increase. Now, when supply and demand are out of balance like that, it will always lead to some sort of surplus. In the case of the labor market, that surplus ultimately becomes unemployment.
So we have some evidence here. So here's some national, the current national unemployment rates for the population overall, and then also broken down by ethnic groups. And so, Dan, how would we look at these numbers to actually see probably the best evidence that there's unemployment due to restrictions on the labor market?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, to kind of get a picture of what's going on with this data right here, it's best to think of an example like, let's say outside of Detroit, a gas station, you're an owner and looking for an employee. You have two employees come in. One's African American from the inner city, maybe has a minor drug offense. The inner city is tough. The education system isn't so good in the inner city through no fault of, out of their own. So they don't have very good education. They don't have reliable transportation. They have to take a bus from the inner city, don't have high income. And the other person is a white kid from the suburb that went to a very good school. His mom and dad bought him a car, has reliable transportation. Who are you going to hire in that circumstance if you have to hire them at the same wage? It's pretty obvious you're going to choose the white kid that has the better education and the more reliable transportation. Unfortunately, that really harms, through no fault of their own, the people that grew up in the inner city, and in particular the African Americans. Ever since you saw minimum wage laws implemented, you've seen a drastic rise in African American unemployment, especially among teenagers.
And we've also seen a reduction, well, for all workers over the last 7 years or so of the labor force participation rate. But this would be relayed because if somebody is unable to find unemployment and they stop looking for work, they're going to be counted as out of the labor force altogether. And so we can also see here for blacks that their labor force participation rate is lagging behind whites, right? So I guess this would be further evidence of this effect.
Yeah, absolutely. It's trying to solve the underlying problem is the education, K through 12 education, the problems in inner cities, illegitimacy rates in inner cities. Those are the types of problems, but you can't solve that by mandating a similar wage. It's like mandating that all used cars sell for $10,000. Well, you're just no longer gonna you're not going to purchase a $5,000 car for $10,000. So if you set a wage rate higher than the wage rate that those people actually provide for the employer, then they're going to be unemployed.
I think to jump into on top of that, and
Sure.
actually here
So
you go with
we
this
have
as well.
the unemployment rate for teenagers. We can see that,
Right.
I mean, just for comparison purposes, the overall national unemployment rate is at 7.3%. And we can see that for both white and black teenagers in this case, the rates are much higher. And so would this be related to the fact that the teenagers would have fewer of these job skills than, say, adults?
Very much so. I mean, when you look at something like an entry-level job, many times, well, really, or just look at teenagers in general, they have very little or very few skill sets to begin with. So one of the best ways that any teenager, a 16-year-old kid, can compete is through a lower wage by offering, well, I understand I don't have any skills, but I'll also be willing to work for $4 an hour versus somebody else that might have more skills, work for a higher wage, or just demand a higher wage in general. Again, I always find it interesting when I walk into Walmart. I always see generally grandparents greeting me at the door, and I never see teenagers. And I wonder if a large part of that might simply be due to the fact that the wage differential and the minimum wage required might exclude them from that market among many other markets as well.
Mm-hmm. Now, couldn't it just be the case, though, that businesses, if we asked them to, businesses make a lot of money, and so, I mean, if we were going to require them through either a minimum wage law or a living wage law or by further encouraging unionization, I mean, couldn't businesses actually just afford to pay higher wages or in some cases benefits for workers as well? I mean, wouldn't they be able to afford this?
Well, that's a common misconception, but these businesses are all running pretty lean. If you look at Walmart, running pretty lean operations already. And it's really difficult to be able to raise the cost of those employees without seeing the increase in unemployment. You see things similar, like Obama proposed or implemented a 30% increase in the average tariff rate on tires. And that was with the explicit point of decreasing the number of tires purchased from China. Same thing with emissions taxes, right? You impose a tax on emissions and to discourage people from emitting. Same thing with sin taxes, like alcohol. If you want to discourage the use of alcohol, you increase the tax on it. Well, you're doing the same thing with the minimum wage. You're essentially putting a tax on the cost of employing somebody, and that's going to encourage companies to look for alternatives to employing people. And they're going to switch to higher skilled workers, and they're also going to switch to machinery, like you see with McDonald's doing in Europe right now.
Mm-hmm. And so then, I mean, what would be some of the other effects of a minimum wage on businesses, and then also the economy as a whole?
Well, I think that some of those secondary effects that a lot of people don't really think about is if you are mandated to pay a higher wage. Well, we understand that when it comes to employee compensation, there's a whole bundle that you sort of put together, not just wages, but also some of the benefits and some of the workplace environment, safety issues, anything like that, that also go along with that. So if you're mandating automatically a higher wage, some other results that you might see emerge might be worse conditions within the workplace. It allows employers to actually increase the types of demands that they place on their employees. In many instances, quite possibly detrimentally to those employees, and ultimately, largely because what you see is at the end of the day, an employee or an employer can look at one of their employees and say, at this point, there are a lot of other people that would be willing to take this job because of the higher wage. So, either live with it or get out, effectively.
Now, what percentage of the American workforce, or do very many people work at minimum wage, and what does that tell us about how it is that businesses go about setting wages in the economy?
Well, currently about 98% of Americans, hourly full-time employees, don't receive the minimum wage. So it's a small segment of the population, but the effect on that small segment of the population of minimum wage is actually very large, especially if you raise it, you're going to price a lot of these workers out of the job market. So, and it's the particular type of worker, the low-skilled workers that you're actually trying to help with the minimum wage are going to be those that are going to be hurt the most by the minimum wage.
So you're saying then is that businesses actually pay more than they're required to most of their employees, right?
Yeah.
Are unions forcing them to do it? Why is it that businesses are paying more than they have to for workers?
Well, they're paying, I don't know if I'd say that they're paying more than they have to. What they're ultimately paying, again, you see 98% of the workforce, as Dan said, the hourly workforce, actually earns above the minimum wage. And they earn that because that's the amount that they actually produce, right? It's all about how productive is the employee. The vast majority of employees in the U.S. are far more productive than the minimum wage. Again, it's just that small sliver of the population that is really adversely affected as a result of a minimum wage through higher unemployment, worse working conditions possibly, if that's the case, anything like that. Again, it's really all about how productive are you as an employee.
So I mentioned this earlier, but I think it's worth coming back to this. Would government-mandated benefits for workers have an effect similar to the minimum wage?
Absolutely. Anytime you raise the cost of employment, you're going to increase the cost to employers and therefore raise the cost of labor, and so therefore employers are going to buy less labor. So if in that can find even not just the cost of benefits, but the cost of regulation, the more paperwork you have to fill out, the more lawyers you have to pay to hire someone. All of those costs mean lower employment for these low-skilled workers.
Mm-hmm. So it would seem that between these proposals to raise the minimum wage and the Obamacare mandates for employer-provided insurance, it would seem like there might actually be a double whammy that's going to be imposed on the labor market, right?
I would think very much so. I mean, in the sense that, again, when you really look at the recovery associated with or after the economic crisis, it has been an extremely slow recovery. A lot of that you see right in the middle of the crisis, an increase in the minimum wage from, I think it was $5, I believe, before, up to $7.25 an hour. Mm-hmm. Again, in the middle of an economic recovery, well, in the middle of an economic crisis, that's extremely detrimental in labor markets. On top of that, increases in regulation and regulatory requirements make any business activity more costly, makes recovery slower, makes unemployment remain relatively higher than it might otherwise be.
You mentioned the recovery, the sluggish recovery, and one of the things that seems a little different about the discussion of the minimum wage in this case is that some very reputable economists have suggested we to raise the minimum wage, to increase aggregate demand, to increase as a way to try to get the economy back to full employment. Prominent economists like Christina Romer, who's been on the President's Council of Economic Advisors. And so just briefly, what mechanism might be at work there to allegedly lead to an increase in demand that might boost overall employment, and then do we think that that's likely to happen or not?
Okay. Yeah, sure. Well, when you look at something like that, ultimately there's kind of this, I guess, multiplier effect where, if you increase worker wages, then they'll be able to go out and spend more. Through their increases in spending, it should have a stimulative effect on the overall economy as a result of that. So I guess some of the larger and broader issues associated with trying to increase the minimum wage enough is one important aspect to look at is really the difference between some of the short run effects and some of the long run effects. Even if we were to agree with this possibility that it might increase aggregate demand in the short run, aggregate expenditures in the short run, acts as sort of a stimulus. One larger issue is that it leaves less by raising employee salaries. It leaves less for businesses to actually be able to reinvest into their companies, and as a result of that, through lower investment in the future, it means we have lower productivity and actually lower wages as a result of that. Lower wages, lower output, and lower economic activity and economic growth.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I'll add on to that. If you want a real sustained increase in economic growth and wages, well, what you need to do is raise employees' productivity. Mm-hmm. And you can't do that with the minimum wage. You got to do that if you got to fix the K through 12 education system. You got to take care of those inner city problems. That's what we should be addressing, not these Band-Aid solutions and trying to force it through employers, trying to force them to pay a higher wage than the person is actually worth. That's only going to drive businesses under the table and make the recession worse.
Well, wouldn't if businesses do have to pay more for their for lower wage or low skilled workers, and they do cut back some on the amount of number of such workers they hire, I mean, there's still going to be an effect on businesses' costs, and that's going to translate into cost of prices. So isn't that going to offset some of whatever stimulative effect that the increased spending by people who now make $15 an hour as opposed to, say, $8 an hour might have?
Yeah, absolutely. Those increased costs are going to be offset. There's economists all the time say there's no such thing as a free lunch, mm-hmm. and that's absolutely true. You have to look at the seen and the unseen. Well, yeah, you will raise some workers' wages. You're also going to raise a lot of costs. You're going to unemploy other workers, and it's in that particular segment of the population that I'm particularly concerned about is the really low-skilled workers that are going to lose out from this proposition.
Mm-hmm. Well, you mentioned earlier there's some problems that we have with like the K through 12 education system in trying to raise workers' qualifications or skills. But okay, this isn't showing up. This diagram hasn't showed up nicely, but we did want to get into the issue of educational attainment and unemployment. Now, this diagram was showing the bars here were going to be the unemployment rates, I think, for people based on educational attainment, based on whether they have whether they had a master's or bachelor's degree, a college degree, or if they had just a high school degree or no high school degree at all. So we're trying. The figures would show that, as you might expect, the unemployment rate was much higher for people with either just a high school degree or no high school degree at all, and then we consequently also see a much lower labor force participation rate. Now, I mean, is that a surprise at all, or how does the ability to work on the job affect relate to educational attainment?
Right, yeah. I mean, for very low-skilled employees, for the 16-year-old kid that's in high school, no real skills, having the opportunity to really take that first job, that first step, to build those skills and to demonstrate to other potential employers that you are consistent and that you can work and work hard, that's really what the minimum wage sort of undermines in a lot of ways, the ability to sort of jump up on that first rung on the ladder and attain those skills and abilities that will allow you to develop further in life. I mean, I remember when I was 12, I got my first job on a paper route. Right now, again, if you have to, paper route, there wasn't any minimum wage standard, so I think I was probably working for about $1.50 an hour at the time. But if you mandate a minimum wage, right, say $10 an hour, well, are you going to hire the 12-year-old to go deliver newspapers, or are you going to hire the guy around the corner that has a car that can go drive those newspapers around to the neighborhood and everything else? Right? I mean, you think, Dan, that was something you were getting at earlier, but again, you really undermine the opportunity to build those skills in really low-skilled workers.
But okay,
well, I was just going to add in, it's pretty interesting. As a college professor, I charge students to give them skills that they're going to need for employment. And we're looking at the minimum wage. These employers are providing them arguably more important skills like punctuality, language, if English isn't their first language, giving them the first job reference, just teaching them how to engage in business and basic social skills. They're actually offering to pay these employees to learn those skills. And that's probably arguably the bigger part of the compensation that they're going to get from getting that minimum wage job, is that they're going to get those skills, going to get references and be able to move up the economic ladder.
Does anybody actually move up from minimum wage jobs? Because we certainly hear a lot of discussion about how you can't afford to support a family at a minimum wage, and yet perhaps only 2% of the workforce actually works at minimum wage. Is it actually possible to move up and earn raises and that's earn enough eventually to be able to support a family in this fashion? Or
I think absolutely. I think if you look over time, the statistics are pretty clear that a worker in the lowest fifth of the American society is able to move up over time. Now, there are some that stay in that lower category, and a lot of those have a lot of like illegitimacy, drug addictions, alcohol addictions. But most people, if they're able to take advantage of this, take advantage of the minimum wage job, are able to move up over time in the American society. And I think I'm an example of that myself. I started out young working on my own. I grew up in a poor family. I've been able to work up, and I think there's a lot of people across America that have been able to benefit from being able to say, I'll work for a low wage, I don't have skills, but I'm going to work up and I'm going to become more valuable over time.
Now, if people can't find a job, especially these people who are just starting out and they can't find that first job, I mean, what's going to end up happening to them? If they don't have the job skills to enter the labor force making $15 an hour, what's going to happen to these individuals?
Well, I mean, ultimately, it just becomes that much more difficult to eventually find any sort of gainful employment. It's not much beyond that. It's extremely difficult.
And I think that highlights the importance of ensuring that the cost of labor compliance, all the regulation, minimum wage, that you keep those as low as possible so that even if an employee has low skills, that they're able to find employment somehow, and it also keeps the cost of starting up a business low as well. So a lot of these people probably have ideas to start up like a lawn care, maintenance firm. There's a lot of career opportunities or business opportunities out there, and if the cost of labor compliance and regulation in general is low, you're going to see more people starting up businesses and providing those types of jobs.
So here we have the labor force participation, right? And you can certainly see that not only do people with only just a high school degree or not having a high school degree face high unemployment, they're also just less likely to work. So I mean, what are we seeing then? If these people aren't working, what are they doing? Are these individuals going to be on government assistance, or are they just not? The people aren't working.
Well, you have to be careful to dig into these statistics. I suspect that a lot of these are eventually young people or maybe even older people that no longer get those higher, they don't need the higher wages to sustain themselves. So either you're a young person just trying to make it, get through college, stuff like that, or you're older person, just retired, and you just taken a small job at the time to work yourself up.
Mm-hmm. And this is just shows, this is hourly wage earnings. It's hard to see, but or weekly. These would be median weekly earnings.
Mm-hmm.
And if you don't have a high school diploma, your median weekly earnings are just over $10 an hour. I was trying to illustrate here the earnings effect of.
Mm-hmm.
But it would seem that then you're talking about a whole section of the labor force that isn't going to be able to work. If the the minimum wage were raised to $15 an hour, I mean there's
right.
a large segment of the labor force, and as you pointed out, in many cases these are the victims of our poorest, of our worst K through 12 education system. So
Mm-hmm.
they haven't had a chance to go to a good school and earn and learn enough to have job market skills. And then if they want to enter the labor force and try to build up labor skills that way, the minimum wage is going to shut them out of the market. So it seems like a vicious circle
Right.
that they'd be facing here.
And again, I mean, that's really what we're looking at, and something that you need to consider is, as we've been talking about, it's more trying to find ways to increase worker productivity. Educational attainment is one of the best ways to try to find ways to figure out solutions to improve that, really, rather than just mandating these sort of one-size-fits-all minimum wages.
Well, are there any other consequences of economic costs or consequences of a minimum wage that we should be aware of, that people should be aware of?
Well, I think a major one is if you look at inner cities, they already have huge problems with drug usage, illegitimacy, K through 12 education. You add on the fact that they can't get a job because you raise the minimum wage so high, well, then you're stuck on a life on the streets. And that means drug usage, selling drugs, and I think all of that combines together. It may be another consequence of the minimum wage. If you can get a job and start earning skills, and hey, you can work your way up in society, like my professor at George Mason, Walter Williams. He grew up in Philadelphia in a bad part of the city, worked his way up through a minimum wage job, and was able to acquire the skills necessary to get a higher wage that weren't being provided in the educational system.
That seems like just yet another part of the maybe a triple whammy here, because if you need to get a part-time job or work to support oneself in school, if you aren't coming from a family with the resources to send you to college on your own, then you're likely to need one of these part-time or one of these lower paid jobs, and they're the exact jobs that are going to be hurt or disappear with a minimum wage or a much higher minimum wage. So any final thoughts on whether we're likely to see a $15 minimum wage in the U.S. anytime soon, or whether you think a living wage proposals are going anywhere?
Nationally, I don't think that's a possibility. You hear talk about it all the time, but I don't think that it'd be anything that would come. It's quite possible maybe a state might pass something like that. A number of municipalities have passed some living wages. I believe San Francisco, maybe some. Did we talk about Seattle?
No.
I think that they were at least discussing. So,
well, thank you very much, gentlemen, for your coming on EconVersations, and thank you for your viewing. We'll be back next week with another episode of EconVersations.